Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled UDI Product Data in UDAMED, Get on Board. I know this is a hot topic for everyone, so I'm very excited to hear the presentation today. My name is Tom Risch. I'm a medical device guru here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be the moderator for today's event. As I said, it is a special presentation for you today. I know our presenters, Gary Sainer and John Lawrence, are really looking forward to sharing their best practices for UDAMED preparation and helping you better understand medical device registration scenarios, UDI data elements, and requirements. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce the presenters and their consultancy, ReadTech, I'm going to touch on a few logistical items real quick. First of all, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end of that, where Gary and John have been kind enough to answer your questions. I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side. We will get to as many of them as time permits. We will also be sharing the full recording and slides with all registrants after the webinar, so keep an eye on that email after this. I'd also like to share a few quick words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've participated in one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions or by partnering with world-class medical device consultants like today's presenters, Gary and John. We also do it through our award-winning medical device QMS software. For those of you who said you were interested in learning how Greenlight Guru software can improve your audit planning, performance, follow-up, and reporting, a member of our team will be reaching out after the webinar to kick off the conversation. If you haven't connected with us yet but would like to, just head on over to www.greenlight.guru after the webinar to schedule a brief time to talk with somebody from our team about how we can help you manage your quality system. Now on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give you a proper introduction to your presenters today. Gary Sainer is a subject matter expert on medical device, unique device identification, and other structured content reporting to regulatory agencies and commercial organizations. He has over 30 years of experience in software development, process management, and data administration, with the last 15 years focused on the life science industry. He serves as co-chair of the industry's structured product labeling technical team and on the advisory board of the medical devices group. John directs electronic submission and regulatory requirement initiatives that impact the medical device industry. He has advanced experience with machine-to-machine submission requirements to global UDI databases, including USA, FDA, GUDID, I never know how to say that, but they'll tell you how to, EU EUDAMED, and China NMPA UDID. They're the acronyms in the medical device industry. They never fail. John represents ReadTech in membership with MedTech Europe and actively participates in electronic submission pilots to regulator UDI databases. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenters, Gary and John.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I know John and I are excited about sharing some of this information. We collaborated, worked on some of the content and made sure it was updated for what's going on. And that's a continual job. You just never finish because there's so much activity and other changes in the environment. And since it's relatively new across the industry, a lot of regulators are fine-tuning, whatever their approach is. So today, what we'd like to do is focus in on the European Union, the medical device regulation, and the in vitro diagnostic regulation. So John and I will probably use some nicknames there, MDR and IVDR. Take a look at that. We understand that those in the audience might be approaching this topic with not too much background, maybe kind of fresh learning about UDI and the requirements for Europe. They may or may not have experience with submitting some medical device records to the United States FDA. But we'll kind of level set what the environment is in the European Union as far as the regulations go. And then we'll talk more about the database that the European Commission has set up. So EUDAMED, yet another acronym. So the state of play on what's happening there, that's always seems to be in flux. It has not met the original timeline, but there's a lot of activity and some voluntary submissions that can be made now. We'll get into those details. And then after we set that framework, we would like to move over and focus in on medical devices, specifically what are the UDI and product registration requirements and how you go about meeting those requirements. Some of the things that we have seen already, and we'll ask John to share some of those experiences, managing that particular product. And then we won't focus too much, but we will at least touch on the labels for the European Union market. There's some new requirements related to the MDR that and the IVDR that would have to be complied with. The other section that we'll spend some time on, and a lot of questions come up about what the heck should I be doing now? So, this is coming down the pike. It's been rescheduled, and, some have just kind of put their head in the sand and hoped it would go away, but that does not appear to be happening. It looks like it's alive and well. So what do you need to do now? So we'll touch on these particular topics and have a little bit of a Q&A at the end when we get done. Before we get rolling into the first topic on the regulations, I just want to do a quick share of some of the information about ReTech, and would like to have you be aware that we've been working on this particular topic for many years, with some roots that go back into the pharmaceutical use by the FDA of the SPL particular document. This is an XML file that captures pharmaceutical information. That particular format was also used for capturing medical device UDI. So we have some long-standing experience with that. We keep track of what's going on. MedTech Europe subscription and attendance there is very valuable for what's been going on in Europe. And we do have these systems that have been working with the FDA database, now has over 2,500 records to the European Union. Test records are being sent, and it has expanded. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the other regions of the world, other health authorities. So we have connections to China and South Korea, API connections in those particular scenarios. And we've done a lot of these submissions. So we're able to share some of the experience that we have, representing 32% of all the electronic records that have been sent to the FDA, good idea, have passed through ReTech. So we've seen a lot of different variations, and hopefully be able to share some of that knowledge of how things are handled. And we are very fortunate to and happy to participate with many of our customers as a team partner. So we'd like to be supplying a particular portion of information to that team, providing subject matter expertise, providing a tool, and being able to be considered a trusted team partner. We consider that a very fortunate opportunity and really love to do that. There are a number of associations that we're also connected with. We won't go into all those, but they do allow us to have a lot of industry knowledge and in many cases a forum where we can share our information. With all that said, let's move into our first topic, the medical device regulation and in vitro diagnostic regulation. For those that have done some homework on this, a couple of these beginning slides will be repetitive. Please bear with us. And we do understand that many of those in the audience are probably experiencing this or receiving this information for the first time. So would like to share a little bit about the history about why all this distortion and disruption in the European Union came about. And it goes back a number of years, and the story is much more longer than what we can handle today. But there was some weaknesses in the regulatory framework. There was legislation passed to reform the platform, which was built around directives. So there were 3 directives there for medical devices, active implantable medical devices, and in vitro diagnostics. So those 3 are now replaced by 2 regulations, a medical device regulation and then an in vitro diagnostic regulation. And something very subtle happened there. The previous platform and framework was under directives, and so they're not binding at the member state level. So each of the countries might implement it slightly different, have a lot of national rules and variations. Regulations that were rolled out are different. They are legally binding, and each member state needs to conform to those regulations. So that is the good news. There will be a lot more uniformity across country to country inside Europe. The bad news is these regulations pretty much wipe the table and put a whole new set of specifications and guidance documents and new framework and so on. We'll take a look at that. But that does set the stake in the ground and say, okay, now we're going to adhere to these new regulations. And I feel for those in the audience that are manufacturers, it's a rigorous task to understand everything it needs to be adhered to and put all the work and effort in meeting those regulations. As mentioned, there's a number of sweeping changes to the process. So those notified bodies that were acting under directives, they have to be redesignated, no grandfather. So, start out from scratch. All products need to be re-registered. And in the course of the regulations, some products were elevated to a higher class, or now they might need additional clinical reevaluation and perhaps even clinical trials. All products will need to have UDI and be registered in this new database, UDAMED. So, and it goes on, labeling, quality management systems. I know Tom and his team over there at Greenlight Guru doing a wonderful job of sharing information about how you meet the quality management requirements for the European Union, and building upon what you might have in another region like perhaps the US, and then extending it to EU. In the process of the regulations that are rolling into force, many manufacturers are stepping back and saying, well, wait a minute, what are the timelines? Who do I have on board? What particular systems are affected? And are there some products that I might decide to no longer market in Europe just because of the effort to meet all the compliance regulations? And it just is a disruption that needs to be addressed. And planning for that can be a rigorous task. The European Commission actually wrote out a little document that identified a step-by-step guide. And, this is the highlights, the table of contents, basically, whole bunch of activities to go through. Today, we're going to focus in on number 9 there, execute a master implementation plan. And when you actually start reading about that, there are a number of sub-projects inside that particular item. So that just that one item now has a whole bunch of additional items running from documentation and registration, labeling, and so on. Today, with the time allotted, we're going to focus in on 2 of those, the unique device identification registration requirement, and touch a little bit on the labeling requirement. Now, there's a number of documentations, legislative updates and amendments and additional acts that, supporting acts that have come out, and that we won't go into all of those. The other particular group of documentation that I want to highlight here is from a group called the Medical Devices Coordination Group. So this is a group that has European Commission representation on it and member state representation on it. And they work out a lot of the technical aspects of the regulations and provides very helpful guidance. Now there's, I don't know, I haven't counted the grand total, but probably at least over 50 of these. I pulled out some of the more recent guidance documents relative to UDI. But if you follow the link at the top, the guidance document list, and you'll see the full list there, and there's various categories on topics and so on. Very valuable and reflects current thinking of this medical device coordination group. And technically, it's not the letter of the law, but the European Commission endorses this activity. So this is information that provides the rules of the road and the framework. Now we talked about getting on board and using a train analogy. So this type of information gives you information about when the train leaves, what you need to pack for the train, and what accommodations on board, that sort of thing.
How long the journey is.
And right, how long the journey is, when the next stop is, whatever.
Right.
Very helpful in your journey down the track. One of the things that happened in the background was an increasing concern about the in vitro diagnostics, and I don't want to take a whole lot of time there because I know it doesn't reflect everyone in the audience interest. There's a lot of medical device manufacturers, but I do want to touch on this because there was some stats and some delays in getting in vitro diagnostic specifications together. If you compare the expected number of in vitro diagnostics under the directive to under the regulation, they expect a decrease, 22%. Well, you think, well, what's the problem? But when you start to understand what the IVD regulation rolled out, you see that the number of assessments that needed to be done by a notified body was only like 8% of the market. And all the rest of those products, 92% of the product market, was self-certified. That scenario almost flips. So now 77% of IVDs need to have a notified body assessment, and only 23% can be self-certified. So what happened is that many IVDs were now elevated to a higher risk, and therefore are needing to have a notified body evaluation and a certificate. That is a huge amount of additional work. Even though the number of devices is expected to go down a little bit, this is phenomenal. Roughly 2 or 10 times as large as before. The other concern was that the number of notified bodies that were being designated, basically they meet the criteria to evaluate and perform, those evaluations, was coming on very slowly. So there was 22 of those notified bodies that were able to evaluate and provide certificates under the directive, but that ground to a halt, are unable to do that. And now in the date of application, the IVDR, the regulation, needs to be followed by notified bodies, and there's only 6 of those. And we went out actually today and did a count, and this particular stats were done back in October, but the 6 remains as of today. There's still only 6 notified bodies that are designated. So there's more in the pipeline. I understand that, but they're not up to speed yet. And the progress of applying those certificates was very, very low. So there's just a few trickle certificates that were coming out on in vitro diagnostic regulation. All of that to say, there was this pending crisis, and it became apparent, and actually European Commission rolled this in with the pandemic and basically put some justification to have a delay or some other accommodation for the implementation of the new medical device regulations. So there's a number of subpoints there about the proposal. It was actually adopted by European Parliament in December of last year, December 15. Couple things to take away there. One is it's not changing the date of application. That actually has a little bit of a reference back to another amendment to the MDR where the actual date of application was delayed 1 year. But that's not the case in this amendment. So the date of application still remains firm. And there was no change for those self-certificate products. But, and there's a couple other changes there. But down at the bottom, the important thing here is that the legacy IVD transition period was extended 1 year. So that allows products that had a certificate to continue to be placed on the market for additional year. And then there was a schedule for those IVDs that were upclassed, if you will, where they did not have a directive certificate, but now they would need to have a certificate under the regulation. And that schedule is shown here on the right-hand side. The place on the market can go out now for Class Ds to May of 2025, Class Cs May of 2026, and May of 2027 for those Bs and those A sterols. So there's a couple of changes. If you have further question about in vitro diagnostics and timing, glad to connect up later and talk a little bit more about that. But just a heads up, this was very valuable to ease the pain of the transition. Before we go too far along, John and I will be using terms like a legacy device or a MDR, IVDR device, and might even talk about some of those equivalent devices. In the regulation, there's these terms that are used, and as you start to look at your portfolio, you might fall into a particular bucket for one of these. The legacy device has a directive certificate attached to it and is able to and is placed on the market after the date of application for a period of time. We'll go into those timing requirements in a little bit, but that does not last forever. There's a line in the sand. You can't go past that. So there's a date where that actually does expire. So that's a legacy device. They do need to be registered in UDAMED, but there's some special identifiers. An equivalent device looks just like the legacy device. In fact, it is the very same device. It has the same specs, the same design. You put them side by side and they will appear identical. The major difference is that the equivalent device now has met all the regulations of the MDR and the IVDR. So those specifications are pretty far reaching, but they met all the technical documentation, and now they are placed on the market under the jurisdiction of being a compliant to the MDR, but they're physically the same. So that is referred to as an equivalent device. And under the regulation, they have a long period of time. So, you know, until there's a significant design change, you can still continue to market that equivalent device. Some companies are using this particular transition to roll in some pent-up design changes, or there's a market need or an opportunity to change the product. Maybe they add some additional capabilities, but now it's not technically the same. So a real subtle for those people that are keeping a close eye on the screen here. You know, there's 2 loops in that stethoscope. Now there's only a single loop in the stethoscope. So there is a design change, and it has to be evaluated to the MDR. And again, that might require some additional studies, clinical trials, or whatever, to make sure that the change is safe and effective. So that opens up that bucket, and you might have to put some documentation in that bucket to go forward. So I guess using our train analogy, you're going to have to get a new ticket for this particular product to get on the train with this particular product. The other noteworthy thing is that when these two products do adhere, the equivalent in the MDR product do adhere to the MDR, there is now this requirement for UDI. And there's accompanying things, that the MD symbol, medical device symbol. No such requirement under the directive. So if you did not have UDI on the directive product, that does not need to be added during the transition period. So still able to be printed out as it stands. All right, so that covers a lot of the background for the medical device regulation and in vitro diagnostic regulation. Certainly, it's a very broad topic. We talk a little bit more about devices in the registration aspect, but what we would like to do now is change the conversation, move it over to the database that the European Commission set up to record information about the medical device itself. So we'll refer to this as the state of play and try to give an idea of what's going on. I feel for those in the audience that need to adhere to the European Union requirements and make submissions to EUDAMED. Because this is one of many health authorities. So this is a very busy schedule that John and I have been keeping up to date, where health authorities around the world have rolling deadlines. We won't go into those, but realize that the European Commission is one of many that is asking for your attention and compliance. So in 2021, 2022, it got really busy with the European Union. That date of application for the MDR came into play. Currently, we're just in this first quarter of 2022, so we see this voluntary submissions. We'll talk more about that. And then we have the date of application coming up in a few months for the in vitros. And then looking way out in the future, we see end of 2023, most likely the expected mandatory period would start for the EUDAMED, and we'll get into a lot of those details. EUDAMED is made up of 6 different modules, so it's a huge database. It's not just one entity. So going from left to right there, the economic operators, UDI and medical device registration, certificates and notified bodies, clinical investigations, vigilance, and market surveillance. So there's various stakeholders, primary stakeholders associated with each one of those modules. The first one there, the actor module, those particular stakeholders are able to go in and register, and as a result of registering, receive a single registration number for their company, so an SRN. That's free, up and running, active right now. If you have not done that, highly encourage you to do that. Second module, the UDI device registration, and actually the certificate module next to it were rolled out October of last year and are now able to accept voluntary data. So we'll talk a lot more about that, because that's the UDI module is the primary focus of our discussion today. The other 3 are under development, and we'll take a look at their expected delivery and timelines. This chart has timeline across the bottom. We know of those 2 very significant milestones: the MDR date of application and the IVDR application, 2021 and 2022. With the IVDR just very close, couple months away, so we're sitting just after the mark of 2022 here. So a couple things happened, before this event. One, that actor module became available in December of 2020 and for voluntary use. And then in October of 2021, last year, those two modules, device and certificates, were rolled out. And we expect the other three modules to start to develop and be formed. And there's something called a playground that a few companies are able to do some testing, do some early exposure and learning, and just starting to exercise those three modules. And that would be in a playground environment. So there was a similar playground environment, by the way, for device and the certificate module. We here at RETEC were able to connect up and submit a number of those products, product records through the UDI device under the playground as well. So it's very valuable, but it's not widely open to industry.
Right.
John, there's some activities that we've been connected with here. We're looking forward to this audit date. So development has to be done before the audit starts at the end of 2023, or beginning of 2023 rather, and then expected to run 6 months. And then everything is triggered off that successful UDAMED notice. So I think you had mentioned there's some upgrades even to the device module. And can you just give us some insight about what's going on here?
Absolutely. So the Commission's delivery roadmap is quite aggressive. I suppose if you compare it to what has been achieved to date to what is still yet to be achieved. As you mentioned, those vigilance, clinical investigation, market surveillance modules, those are just in development right now. So in development, I don't believe started until sometime in Q4 perhaps of 2021, as they were rolling off of, as the team was rolling off of device registration certificate modules. Though they have communicated that they expect quarterly releases to the playground, where are actually both the production and playground. It's just the production releases will only contain changes that they're making to the device, actor, device, and certificate modules. They're not going to release vigilance or any of the other modules in production early in the same way that they did previously. So we expect to start seeing the results of their development efforts as they release at the playground. So testing can be done. I believe their focus is on not initially on data exchange, even for vigilance. I believe they're just trying to get MVP features out initially to get feedback as quick as possible. And I believe, as you mentioned, to have all of development done by the end of this year. That includes a little period they're reserving for change requests for features that they would consider as being MVP, minimum viable product type features. So it's really important if you do have access, if you're part of, when a team that has access to the playground. And I was looking at some of the questions coming in, and there were some comments about the playground being, not working so well. So assuming some folks on the line have the access, it's obviously going to be critical to be participating in testing and things that you're finding that are not working so well to be sent over to the UDAMED support team over DG Sante, so they have that information, and it's at least in their queue of issues to be worked through. From our perspective, as was mentioned, the bugs we were even reporting, looking at this now just from the UDI module, we've been testing the playground for well over a year, whenever it first came up for data exchange for UDI. And we essentially, every time they perform a release, and if they change the schema, we have to retest everything that was previously working to ensure there was no regression type issues as they're making changes. One thing with UDAMED is it's a single schema that they're using for the entire system. And then there's services for device services, vigilance, so forth. So when they're working on other pieces, they will release a new version of schema, and you have to check, okay, did they Did they change anything to the device? Was there any bugs perhaps that they addressed? I would say the communication and the transparency of the release notes and things like that has been getting better, but it's still not where we would really like it to be, because we're finding things that are not documented, or things that were perhaps broken with each release. So we do expect, and they've said there'll be multiple, from a device module perspective, multiple releases this year. So they're still resolving bugs, fixing issues that were found earlier with what they consider to be the core functionality needed to register your devices into the system. In addition, from a data exchange perspective, there's still a few services that have not even been introduced yet. So there was previously a lot of back and forth about needing to be able to update your data in UDAMED through machine to machine in bulk, right? So data exchange submission. And I believe it might have been the middle of 2021, the commission was like, oh, that's not MVP. You could key in your changes. And there's a lot of pushback on that, saying, hey, if I have thousands and thousands of devices that I need to register, you're defeating the purpose of doing this machine to machine and then go and maintain manually and them out of sync with internal systems. So they did hear that and started getting that work done as well to support the updates. But not every section of the data, if you will, can be updated with the way that the data exchange services work. So what I mean by that is, for example, specifically the marketing information, container package information, there's no way to update that right now within an update submission. So we're waiting for, it's supposed to be out any moment in Q1 in Playground, so we can start testing and giving feedback on that. And another was improvements of the bulk download. You could pull the data back down through machine to machine. And there's been some issues with that on how that's been working that we're really hoping gets improved before they finish off this year and believe they're ready for the audit. This whole MVP concept is something that we all need to be aware of, if you're familiar with that or not. It's like an agile software development term, MVP. Basically, it's like it's good enough to get the job done, essentially. And they're using that language. And you'll notice that when you're talking about issues, to go, we don't consider this MVP. The challenge is, according to which stakeholder is that not MVP? And they're clearly looking at it as MVP to meet that timeline Gary was showing, so that they can at least get into that audit and deem the UDAMED system MVP functional, I guess you could say. So things that we already know are not going to be in MVP are these change requests that they're considering, which we have no timing on. Like, is this going to be something they slip in at the end of the year? Probably not, because they're probably going to be saying, oh, these are only MVP changes we're going to do in Q4 before the audit. But some of these things that we've seen from the device model perspective is the error messaging that comes back when you perform a machine-to-machine submission. There is an issue with it just stopping at pass and fail. And as you know, or will learn, that record has a life cycle within UDAMED. It doesn't just stop at you've made your submission, accepted. Now it's like, does it have certificate data? Does it go through notified body review? And was that approved or rejected? That type of messaging doesn't travel back machine to machine. In fact, the current solution to that is UDAMED's going to email somebody with the status of each of those outcomes. And we haven't seen that working yet. It might be an email address associated with the actor registration, it's unclear. But again, this is another one of those pieces of feedback from, especially within the MedTech Europe data exchange team, where we're saying, when you go machine to machine, you need to really have this thing, closed down. That is a critical piece of information that could trigger other workflows. and I've been really pushing for them to start including that. So I think they hear that message, but they're still not considering that MVP. And then the other piece, again, also with the messaging back, is when you're sending bulk information, say if you go to register one basic UDI with 300 UDI DIs from that family all within one submission to UDAMED, the error messaging with that approach is not very good, correlating to which particular device, which attribute is having the issue. So we were looking for some improvements upon that. And I hate to say this is just a brief summary, because it is very much a work in process with them building this out. And it seems like the commission's perspective is we need to hit these initial dates with, the best functionality we could provide, and then they'll be improving upon this after they do go fully live in production after completing that audit.
So John, while you were talking about that data exchange service, one question came in, probably can answer it right off the top of your head. Is there an option to submit data as a spreadsheet with the content, captured in a spreadsheet and then upload it through the user interface?
No, the only UDAMED user interface file format that they're accepting right now is XML. So it's essentially the same XML file built according to their schema, that they just also, instead of using an AES4 gateway to submit to them the access point, you could upload that file.
Yeah. Well, good luck putting that XML file together without a tool.
Yeah,
technically you could use like a text editor to create that, but there's a whole host of regulations and rules about the scheme and the hierarchy and placing it in there. So it's pretty rigorous. It's not anywhere like putting it into a spreadsheet. So it's much more difficult. Well, it's starting to sound like, John, that this UDAMED train, this MVP version, only has coach cars and no business class cars in it. There's no extra, fluff or extra accommodations.
We're building the engine as we're heading down the tracks.
Yeah. Very interesting. So it's evolving, and who knows what's going to happen. Hopefully there'll be some more progress and more features rolled out. But it's one of those things that it's just keep your ear to the ground, and we here at RETEC try to share that information with you. So, all right. So we now have covered some of the schedule and the timing of the modules as they're rolled out. But we get a lot of questions about what does that actually mean for my products as they're being placed on the market. So as a little bit of a platform here, this timeline picks up where we just left off, where these two date of applications are in play. The UDAMED notice finally comes out. That's indicating the audit has been successful, and now European Unit does this public announcement. That is followed by a 6-month delay that's built into the regulation. And then at the end of that 6-month delay, UDAMED is now officially open for mandatory use. So there's a whole host of clauses and phrases that are triggered on that particular event inside the regulations. One of those happens to be the beginning of an 18-month mandatory registration period. It also marks the beginning of required vigilant reporting. So if there's a serious incident, then at that point in time, you have to report that into the vigilance module inside UDAMED. So there's a number of activities that happen. Noteworthy to say that to report that serious incident, there's a prerequisite that you register that device in the device module. So,
right. And Gary, if I could add one thing, it goes back to this, as we work with the commission to give feedback and we get that MVP response. There's been times that they've said, well, look, you're getting this long window to submit your devices to UDAMED, so we don't have to give you all that functionality on day one, right? But what you just said about the mandatory reporting of vigilance at that date, and you cannot perform that vigilance report without first registering the associated device, it's kind of a little bit of a getcha where, who knows, you may have a lot of devices that you need to get registered sooner rather than later to avoid causing any delays in the mandatory vigilance reporting. So,
so and that has a very short response time. So depending on the severity of that serious incident, 2, 10, or 15 days. And we'll have some recommendations at the end of this presentation, but that is very good reason to work early and start to make some voluntary registrations in place so that you're ahead of the game and have that taken care of well before this mandatory period comes into play. Now, over top of this timeline that we just looked at, there is a time schedule for the legacy devices. Starting with the date of application last year, May 2021, there is a 3-year window where you can continue to place them on the market under the directive. There's a couple criteria, no significant major changes, and the ballot has not expired. So depending on when that certificate was granted and issued, then you might only be like 2 months into this transition period. If you had done some very wise, recertifications near the end or just prior to the date of application, you certainly have like a 5-year window, and therefore you'd be able to consume all 3 years without a problem. But at the end of that 3 years, May 2024, you're no longer able to put that directive device on the market. Now, there is a 1-year sell-off referred to that plan where any products that's in the logistic chain is able to be passed through and eventually, down to an end user. So if you have some things on the shelf or warehouses, whatever, there's a year to have that sell-off. Medical device compliant devices are following a little bit different schedule. So unfortunately, that conversation causes you to talk about the particular class of that medical device. So if it was class 1, not the 1S for sterile or 1M for measuring or the 1R for the reusable surgic, but all the other class 1s that have a self-certification, they have to have the self-certification done to the MDR by the date of application. So that, we're well past that, almost a year into it. So if you have not done that, that's a serious omission. You'll need to make sure that your self-certification is done going forward for your class 1s. The class 2A, B, and class 3s will, before they're placed on the market, will need to have that certification done to the MDR, and then they're able to be placed on the market without a problem. There is 2 schedules regarding those other classes, the 2A, B, and 3s. So there is a schedule for placing UDI on the label. So it's actually in the legislation. They start up with class 3 first. In 2021, if you have a class 3 MDR compliant device out on the market, it has to have UDI on it. And there's won't go in through the schedule there, but pushed out about every 2 years. And in the same fashion, there's fixed dates for UDI to be placed directly on particular products. So there is a section, not all, but a subsection of all the devices that meet the criteria for being reusable, and then they have to have UDI placed directly on the product, and those dates are laid out. Note that the UDI on the labels is now separate and different from the registration time period. That is a nuance to the European Union. if you were coming from the FDA as a reference, those two events, those requirements were synchronized. So whenever there was a need to have UDI in the label, it was also accompanied by the time to register that device. So it just bring that up, that just another thing for the European that complicates the discussion. Now, we don't have time, but there is a similar discussion for in vitro diagnostics, legacy devices. So I alluded to earlier the recent amendment that puts some times in place that extended out the lifespan of the Class D, C, B, and A's. So they're way out here, 2025, 2026, and 2027. If you comply with a IVDR regulation, then it's similar discussion as what we had before. The self-certification needs to be done as of the date of application, and then there's some schedule there for placing UDI on the label itself. So with that, I think we're going to move on and dive a little bit deeper into the aspects of a medical device UDI requirements and getting into some details of the actual product registration. To summarize the UDI requirements as found in the regulation, they centered around like 4 different areas. And the first being the actual label. So you have to identify the product with the UDI, and that means something called the device identifier and the production identifier. And that has to be on the actual product label and the packaging, presented in that human readable, and many times it's just simply a barcode technology. The second, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, those reusable devices have to have another higher level of marking, more permanent marking on the actual product. The third aspect is reporting this information. So the device identifier and a number of attributes, this is well over 102 and changes depending on what version of the data dictionary you look at, but that's a requirement that you need to report that information into that device database. And then there's other surrounding requirements related to UDI. So when there's annual reports that need to be made, UDI needs to show up for that. Post-marketing actually needs to show up on the patient implant card. So this is in a complete list there, just to give you an idea that there's 4 different aspects of the UDI requirements. Just to real quickly, just to make sure that everyone is familiar with UDI and what we're referring to, that particular identifier, it can be this numeric or alphanumeric in some cases, the code, and it's globally unique. So this is good and applied to the product, can be used around the world for all time. So you're never supposed to reuse a device identifier on a different product. It has 2 components, the first being the device identifier that points to a particular manufacturer, so the company, as well as a particular version or model of the product. And then there's a conditional portion, this production identifier, and that is based on whether or not there's some information that is used to control the production and identify a particular lot or manufacturing date. So 4 of those identifiers, the manufacturing date, expiration date, lot or batch serial number, and batch and serial number, are very similar to the FDA. So they have the very same 4 list. Software is broken out separately in the European Union, and if it's present on the label, it obviously needs to be included. There is some conditions about the manufacturing date. If it's the only one on the label, it needs to be there. Otherwise, it's optional. So there's a couple of little rules about what needs to be included in the European Union label. Now, if you take these 2 components and push them together, you have the first component, which is the device identifier, and you might have a full complement of all those. It could be a partial list or it could be none, but here showing all 4 examples are used. And in this particular case, I use GS1 as a particular standard to illustrate this. It's widely used. And that particular standard has some codes in front of those values. And basically that's used to identify the value that follows for computers that are able to read this information and decipher it. Now, in addition to that identifier on the product, we mentioned that there is a number of attributes that need to be reported. And there are, this is probably a good time to introduce the topic. If you're new to the European Union, there is a hierarchy of the reporting and the classification of the products. So there's a group identifier referred to as a basic UDI DI, and John and I will probably use the nickname Buddy periodically. So there's a Buddy identifier, and it has 36 attributes, and it's like the family identifier. So in my family, you know, or any other family, you know, it's the same address, it's the same last name. We get mail at the very same post office, and you know, whatever. So there's some common attributes to that family, and they have to be all the same to be in the family. Inside that family, there's a number of individuals. So, you know, each individual has different first name, you know, hair color, eye color, whatever. So there's unique attributes for that individual. To be a device in a Buddy, all these particular attributes that we're looking at need to be the same. So you have to share the same risk class, and it's probably more granular that it's down to the individual certificate number. So just keep that in mind when you're starting to lay out your grouping of devices inside a Buddy. Yep. Now, at the individual device level, there's roughly 85 attributes, much more granular, and a lot of things to record about that particular device. So the key field over there is the UDI DI, and you also need to report the Buddy. So this is like the first name and last name. So each record here has a link back to the parent, and that's how that relationship is maintained. We won't go into all these, but there's a number of attributes here regarding the device, the designer, the packaging, regulatory safety and characteristics, and so on.
And Gary, I think there was a few questions that were coming in about you know, could you essentially reuse, or what's the difference between your US UDI versus UDI or DI you were using in the EU? And you know, I'd say, well, out of the gate, the EU, you know, the US does not have the Buddy family level, right?
Right.
It's more of just the flat structure of what we see here is like the UDI DI information that's being submitted to the FDA. And some attributes that they're requesting could be similar, but we've noticed in implementing UDI in various regions, you know, you're always going to have uniqueness in each region because there'll be uniqueness for that particular health authority for regulatory purposes. Will be, you know, you don't have FDA listing numbers, for example,
right.
In the EU. So there's some similarities, but I would say probably, unfortunately, out of all the implementations that we've done, EU is probably the most different than the US, if I'm comparing US to South Korea, US to China, and so forth.
Yeah. So the at the foundation of that identifier, let's say you use a device identifier and happen to use a GS1 standard, and there's a couple other standards, HIBIC and so on. At the foundation of that number is unique globally. So you could have the very same device identifier, but across the US and European market, and China, and you know, wherever. But the attributes that are reported for that particular attribute, and there's only a few that are the same and reused, but there's many different region attributes, and those regional attributes, you know, you have to come up with those, and I know John and his team, they spend a lot of effort digging into what really a label and what the specs indicate for that particular attribute. So you might even think that the attribute looks the same. It might have the same label, for example, or the same name, I should say. But if you read the specs surrounding that, it could be slightly different. Or that particular attribute might have a list of values, and the list on the FDA side does not match up exactly. Maybe it's one less or a couple different than the European Union list. So now you might have different attribute values, and therefore you thought this was going to be a shared attribute, but yet in reality it's not. You have to keep separate attributes. So that is a full-time job actually to keep track of all those attributes, when they're different, when they can be shared, and in some cases they could be the same, but for business reasons you might want to make them different. So let's say you have the device identifier. You might have the opportunity to keep the same global address, but for business reasons, okay, I'm going to be selling into Europe. I want a different identifier. I am able to track it financially, for other reasons and so on. So they do have the opportunity to actually change that device identifier. So it becomes a real task to keep all that straight and have all the attributes properly attributed to the corresponding health authority, and in some cases make them the default value and being able to reuse them multiple times. That's actually our specialty, and I know John and his team spend a lot of effort at digging that out and sorting it out. While we're talking about Buddy, or did you have something to add there, John?
No, I think I covered it very well.
Yep. All right. So while we're talking about Buddy, basic UDI, DI, I won't go into this because of time, but we'll leave it there for homework. It is that group identifier. There's some specs about the length. It can only be 25 characters long. Now, each of the standard organizations, GS1, HIBIC, ICC, BBA, and IFA, each of those have guidelines on how to build that. So again, I'll just use GS1 to illustrate the construction of that buddy. So it has that 25 maximum character length. It's used, or the first field is a company prefix, so you should be familiar with that. And then there's a model reference, which you make up on your own. And now there's a 2 check characters at the end. So that's quite different. I'll show a contrasting bit of information down here on the individual device identifier. You notice right away that a G10 for the individual device has an indicating digit not present now in the buddy. The company prefix is the same. There's no additional charge, by the way. Your subscription to the GS1 is able to be reused, and that company prefix is the same. And then, this item reference number, the number of digits here changes by what you subscribe to, but that's quite different. And single check digit for a regular device identifier, and all numbers, by the way, you are allowed to use alpha numerics in the model reference in the buddy, and then it has a generator just like the G10, where you put the previous characters in, and then it returns to a 2 character check digit at the end. And then there's never a barcode, so I won't go into a lot of the details here, but this is really just for information purposes inside EUDAMED. It's not to be put on the product label. There's some references in the technical documents. You have to have this to get started with your notified body, for example, but it never appears on the actual product. I'll show a quick example here of a group for illustrations. This is my forceps. 59 is the 2 check digits, and inside that group I have plastic forceps, and there might be a hierarchy. So 3 of those forceps go into a pouch, and I might even put 2 pouches in a box. But that plastic forceps is a child of the family. I might also manufacture stainless steel forceps, and it met all the criteria that we talked about earlier. It's in the same group. And I have a different model that's stainless steel with locking feature. So I break that apart, and well, you get the idea. So that is able to be put together and able to be. It does have to be reported back to UDAMED, and very early on you have to start figuring out this hierarchy to work with your notified body and for technical documentation and so on. All right, let's do a quick review of the label requirements. There is a sample here from our friends over at Prism ID that they supplied some information about the medical device label, the MD symbol. I recently saw, I think that's now the ISO standard is officially approved and it's final. So the MD is now in the mix as being a recognized symbol. MD does have to appear on the medical device. That's one of the requirements in the legislation. It has to identify the fact that this is a medical device, and MD is the ISO's accompanying signal. There's some warnings, enhanced use of warnings, by the way, language translation. There is, again, provision for using electronic information for use, so IFUs. And to talk about our particular topic of the day here, the addition of a UDI. Now, many companies have been using GS1 standards or other standards that actually qualify for UDI. So that is wonderful. You know, you would not have to make that particular change to the label. There might be some other items that you have to change, but that certainly helps you in this conversion period or this transition period. And yet there are also instances of companies that did not use that particular standard or use it correctly. Perhaps they didn't have all the production identifiers that they needed on there. Now you notice this particular example has, let's see, the lot, the serial number, the manufacturing date, and the expiration date. So because those controls, those identifiers are on the label as standalone items, those values need to be embedded in the UDI. So over on the right hand side, it gives it a little bit of blow up of what's going on. So those values that appear need to be embedded in the UDI production identifier portion. Now, reference number, by the way, is not. So I just want to call that out. The reference or part number is not embedded in this particular device identifier. So that's a quick study on labeling. We could go a little bit deeper, obviously, but I just wanted to touch on that. It's one of the things that need to be on your checklist of things to do. As you're packing your bags to get on that train, this is another thing that you need to check off and say, okay, yeah, I got the label taken care of. Let's move our attention now over to a little bit of discussion about what you need to do now and what you can do now and realize the task at hand. So John and I have called this session "Get on Board." So get on board the train because it is moving on. Now you might have actually jumped on a train at a previous station, meaning that you have already started to submit some voluntary records and you have your SRN number. So you're on the train. That's a good mindset to be on. But now it's pulled up to another station, and here's your opportunity to jump on board and realize what you have to do. One of those first things to become oriented and understand how to board that plane, it's not only just a ticket, there's a lot of planning. So if we take a look at what we refer to as the 4 C's of UDI device registration. Now, realize that we're focusing in on just meeting the device registration module, and that's a portion of everything that has to be done. But one of the primary things is to create an environment for this device, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit more detail. Collect the data, pull that data together, find those data owners and so on, where's the data, and then cleanse it. So this cleansing issue is many times the quality of the data is not as good as expected or hoped to be. So when you place that data into a system and start to do some rigorous validation, you soon realize that, oh, wait a minute, this is not quite as good, or maybe it's stale information and it's not current. And now you have another issue about, how do you, when you change the data, who makes sure that the new updated data is there and so on. Eventually, you move into step 4 and comply with regulations by actually doing the submission. But notice the first 3, you don't even submit anything. There's a lot of work to be done long before you actually, submit data and register the device. So that first task, creating the environment, is putting the team together, put your plan together, and so on. A lot of preparation work, collecting the data and finding the data where it stands. Many times it's in different places, different repositories. This set of information never had to be assembled before, so there's nothing that you can point to and say, oh yeah, it's over here in this corner. It's many times in many different corners. Sometimes it's missing. You need to make values and start recording it and so on. And who's going to control this information when it changes? Putting some governance around it, so putting some procedures and so on. And then I talked a little bit about cleansing the data, making sure it meets all the requirements of the specifications and it validates against them. There is some issues where you might have values like units, for example, might be stored as millimeters, and the actual abbreviation has to be submitted. So there's a little bit of transformation, if you will, of that data to make sure it meets, and perhaps you didn't have the exact wording of the pull down list for a particular attribute. So, mapping up what the actual situation is for like MRI status, for example, and using the proper term for what actually represents it. There's a lot of work there in that cleansing. And then finally, you're able to comply and put everything, get a submission, a process in place, submit the data, and then verify. John, I'm sure, can attest to this situation where many times if you just submit the data electronically, it goes into a black hole. Sometimes we have issues where it never comes back and never acknowledged from the actual health authority. So you have that issue, understanding what acknowledgements are to come back, making sure that they do come back, and then associating them to the record and closing that particular transaction and that publication is all very important. I'll touch on this map. Now, we had put together just a very crude sample plan, and it was actually to help our clients work through the various tasks and put their connection together with RETEC and so on. But it was built back in October of last year. So 2-4 months have gone by, and now things are starting to compress. So if you want to have be in a position of having your initial submissions done just prior, you don't want to be in the last day, a little bit earlier than the actual start of this mandatory period. A lot of companies target this date, where this time period, the allotment time is starting to collapse, and there's a lot to do. If you notice, the largest critical path here is in the collection, importing, cleansing of the data. So we talked about that. There's a lot of startup and training and so on that relatively short compared to the actual cleaning of the data. And in the event you start to consider an electronic transfer of data to a system. There's many different ways to put this in place. You can obviously build your own. You can have a piece of software purchased and installed. In our particular model here at ReTech, we have a software as a solution model, SAS model, where we host data and you basically come in and become a tenant inside that particular system. So some companies would like to build a machine-to-machine connection to our system. So putting all that in place takes a lot of time. Your particular plan will be different, but there's some elements here that will be common. So, getting your time together and how big your inventory is, where your data is, do you need to apply production identifiers and so on. John, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about some of the capabilities that ReTech offers to help clients meet these deadlines. And let's start off with life.
Sure. So essentially, we have, you kind of alluded to it, Gary, we have multiple engagement approaches with our clients. The one where the software as a service, where the client is a tenant of the system. Most times they're utilizing the system to upload their data into our system user interface, utilize our system user interface for workflow, checking the business rule validation as it hits the ReTech validation engine, and perform the submissions directly within the system. So we have that approach, and there's also this premium SaaS approach where with clients that just want to send us the data and say, be done with it. There's some time really for that submission processing piece. Then lastly, the integration, where it's just more of an automated connection to client source systems, where we have APIs available to integrate with client source systems for those who choose to utilize us in that effect. Perhaps there's no business approval workflow needed, so they wouldn't have to come into our system and approve and e-sign submissions. Maybe that's being handled upstream, and it's more just want to send us the data, and we, through the API connection, we transform it into the format required for the health authority and perform and track the submissions. But with single source, what we, our goal is to provide one standard to our clients, whether it's our, a spreadsheet for the tenant users, or it's our XML schema for the users that are looking to integrate. So we have kind of a global UDI schema. So you can focus on that one standard and essentially leave it to us to worry about the mapping of all the specific different formats that the health authorities are requiring. We see on this screen is some channels currently supported with EUDAMED, US FDA Good ID, China, South Korea, all different formats, all different ways you have to connect to those health authority databases, and single sources set up to configure with all of them.
So John, I did have a question there, and we get this answered a lot or asked a lot. Each of those health authorities have a different gateway and protocol and data set. Is there any advantage then in having a connection, a single pipe into the ReTech system that is consistent and uniform, and then therefore the medical device manufacturer doesn't have to worry about that? Do we see that popping up as value?
Yeah, certainly, because if you're going to do an integration and just integrating to our APIs, our APIs aren't going to change based off of, oh, now we're setting up this health authority submission format. Our schema might have to change, but it's a change to a known schema, right? So maybe we're adding an attribute. We're not giving you a whole new schema with attributes called something else, and you have to map all that together. So you still have maintenance if you're submitting to multiple health authorities over time, but it's much more of tweaks. We try to shield that from the customer as much as possible. because we're building in the business rule validation and everything. So it's more about alignment of the data model, and again, us using the consistent APIs for transferring back and forth from client source system.
John, real quickly, you mentioned API. There was a question. What does API stand for? And while you're at it, can you talk also about SFTP?
Okay, sure. So API, well, actually, it stands for Application Programming Interface. it's a method to do web service calls and so forth. The way to transfer, we use it to transfer data and information from one application to another. The SFTP, the Secured File Transfer Protocol, is more of a more of like a folder on the internet that you could drop a file into and give access to someone to go retrieve that file. So I think the usages of API is a bit more, modern, if you will. You notice they're being adopted even at the health authorities, because you'll see on the channel section on the right of this diagram, it has API next to China and South Korea. They're using their own APIs for the actual submission. So it's typically, it's JSON structure is what's utilized to support those APIs. But we do have clients that have used SFTP, and so we do have that available as well. I just also wanted to mention that machine-to-machine feedback on the bottom of the transfer box, that we'll, with those APIs, we also give the data back to the client source system. So if there's any transformations that have to happen upon the submission process, that data, it can get sunk back up with source systems and so forth.
There was a question here, John, while we have this in front of us, probably a good time to talk about it. Is there one big common schema that the US, EU, China, South Korea have adopted? So there is this regulatory, International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, IVDR, that put some guidelines in place a number of years ago when the FDA actually started to roll out their first regulation. But we have seen each health authority have their own regional requirements. So the very first one off the bat, a month or so after the guidance document came out from the forum, the US rolled their regulations out, and they had some differences. So the question though was, does a one big schema exist for all of these particular health authorities? And maybe you want to go on and talk about what RETEC exposes to the client that could in fact be cumulative.
Right. So from like an industry standpoint, other than, like you said, like the IMDRF guidelines, it's not just one, there's not one UDI regulator schema. There's commonalities across their implementations. I look at it more as like their data models, if you will. So there's some overlap in basics of things, but the way that they implement them could be quite different. But for us, with single source, we have one schema. So our schema has, US, Europe, China, South Korea, all of the health authorities that we're supporting through the system are all in that single schema. So, because we can control that, we can control how we receive the data in, and we could, in turn, offer that so that others don't have to worry about multiples. We have mappings of that schema and so forth that maps back to the original, data dictionaries for the health authorities, which we, are glad to share. So when you're implementing that schema, we're all speaking the same language.
Yeah, that's very good. So I see the time rolling in by here. I know there was a couple more things that you wanted to share about the system, and what's And actually, you can, while we're explaining this, there was one question about the ability of manufacturers to submit data now. You know, can they submit to the playground and the production as of today? And maybe you can talk about the solid blue lines and the dotted line, that sort of thing.
Sure. So the commission currently allows us to do two connections, one pre-production connection, which access point, which goes to the playground, and then one that goes to production. So we actually have two lower level and test environments. We have our preview system where that gets updated frequently with changes that are coming from the dev team as we're reacting to change from the health authorities or building out new features. And we have our pre-production UAT system that will align with our next release. So if we're working on things and it's going to preview, and clients who would choose could have access to that those features early. But as we package that up and say, okay, now we're going to call this like single source release, 6 or 7, that's what will hit the UAT system. Then, of course, ultimately after we go through our computer systems validation, we promote that into production. So you can submit from either of those test environments. We do have to switch to it depending on what's going on. So if we're building something brand new, changes for a UDAMED submission use case, that's when we'll probably move that connection to preview, because we're going to want to test that earlier, because you don't get that much from the commission. You get like the updated schema, but in order to test that that's working well, but then move that over to the UAT environment once it stabilizes. So I'm happy that the commission's giving us at least a quarterly targets now as to when they're going to be making changes, because as soon as they make a change, they just drop that new schema in playground and production, and both connections could break. So I'm going to say you can, but we just got to keep an eye on when you're trying to, because something could be happening with the commission changing something, since they're still very much in dev.
All right, very good. So, John, why don't we just kind of sum up? I know you have some best practices, and over the years of submitting data, and more recently with the EU, you have some suggestions for things to adhere to going forward.
Sure, and yeah, these could apply everywhere. And as we're thinking globally, obviously, if you're a global manufacturer, tracking those regions that either have a UDI requirement or have one coming, and as you're approaching it, is there a way that you could approach it from a global perspective and not, hopefully not reinvent the wheel every time you're responding to one of these regulations. One way to do that is, a master data solution. But even if you don't have that, you could at least have a submission solution that could scale and be built upon for as you grow. And I think you've demonstrated, Gary, the start early this session. I guess that's probably clear at this point.
On the train.
Yeah, there's just a lot going on, and throughout this year with UDAMED, right, when they're completing the other modules in Playground and so forth, okay, now vigilance is there, or the others are there. How does that, you start getting a better picture of the process on how it's going to be working with UDAMED that will, allow you to really feel more comfortable when finalizing your SOPs and so forth. So, there's still plenty of work to do. As you share that timeline, it's like, oh, wow, there's tons of time, but I think there's a ton of work as well.
Yeah, there's a number of items there. Some that are pretty much no-brainers. You just go into the actor module and register and get a SRN number, and then assigning basic UDI. If you have a subscription to GS1, no additional charge, and the burden is on you to create that number for the buddy. So nothing stops you from doing that. Already you'll have your company prefix, and there's just a lot of things in the real fine print here, there's connection to your notified body and start
Yep.
the certification
Yep.
process. So that
Yep.
could be that's the tip of an iceberg right there.
Yeah.
How about some of these others, John?
Yeah, well, changes are going to happen. So watching for the updates, we've seen plenty of that on the EU side. China and South Korea, right before New Year's Eve, they dropped new versions of their API specifications on us. So we spent our beginning of the year going to have to assess all that and see, oh, there's some new attributes being requested and so forth. So it just, even once they're implemented, changes happen because they have to improve upon what they have. Then we had here preparing for your infrastructure, of course, because that doesn't happen overnight. And just, of course, us just again plugging that we could help. You know, we'd love to help, as this is what we're doing every day for many years.
Right, very good. We incorporated a number of questions that come through, and we will take those and definitely work with Tom and collect them and address those on an individual basis. There are a couple resources. If you need more information, feel free to contact us. We're glad to talk about your situation, your particular challenges in meeting this requirement. meddevice@retech.com and the phone number there, or go to the website. There's a lot of good information. Our team has put together a number of documents, support documents, and a knowledge center. So with all that said, thank you very much for your attention. John and I want to thank you and let you know that we appreciate this opportunity to share what we have experienced over the last few years, and it doesn't stop. So there's the story continues. So Tom, back to you.
All right, yeah, thank you guys. What a detailed presentation.